So obviously, big spoiler alert on the Flyquest versus Gen G series if you're going to go ahead and watch this video. I recently made a video before the Gen G Flyquest series talking about how Flyquest was kind of wasted potential because in my opinion, they were a top tier team in the world and really had the potential to actually go really far at Worlds, potentially if they fix some of their problems, even contest the world championship. That was my take in that video. And a lot of people were agreeing with me, and a lot of people were not agreeing with me and hadn't really seen that yet. And, obviously now that they've played the series versus Gen G and they had a very close series, but they lost 3-2, a lot of people are asking, okay, well, what are your thoughts now? What now moving forward? What do we think about all of this? And there's a couple of things. Number one is I want to talk about why some people saw what was coming with FlyQuest in terms of them being really good and why some people didn't see that. And I think that it's a really big problem in League. And unfortunately, it goes even to higher levels than it should. And it's really not that big of a deal when it's just everyday guys like you and me who play the game and, maybe we're not following everything super closely and we, just form our takes and opinions on players in the game. That's how, it's going to go with any competitive environment. Not everyone's paying 100% perfect attention. Not everyone understands the game to the caliber that, I do or that other people do. And that's not just an ego thing because I know, like, for example, I'm sitting in D2 right now. So a little bit of background about myself, like I've peaked GM 600 LP. I main support and I have coached a couple of amateur teams before, although, nothing notable there really. But, anyways, so I have a little bit of knowledge, but I'm not the best player in the region. I'm not, that good. But I have an eye for the game that is definitely way beyond what the average player has, right? And one of the things that's really frustrating about esports is that most people form their opinions based on results because they don't have the understanding of the game to form an opinion on teams or on players based on how they're actually playing. And so when I heard why people were saying on that video, hey, I don't get it, I don't think Flyquest is that good, the only reason why they made it out over G2 is because Flyquest got to play versus PSG and Gigabyte Marines and Team Liquid, whereas G2 had a hard matchup and some harder games in general. But it was never really about the fact that Flyquest made it out of Swiss stage and G2 didn't. The reason why I thought that Flyquest was the best team that the West has had in a while was, again, because their innovative drafting, the willingness to not reveal what they were doing to the Korean and Chinese teams, them not playing the Korean and Chinese way of playing the game and trying to beat them at their own game. I think a lot of NA and EU teams go into Worlds and they may even have a meta that, works in their domestic region. And when they get to Worlds and they see that the Eastern teams, which are obviously like the best teams, aren't doing those things, they assume that they're doing something wrong and they start adapting. So when they see a different meta in scrims, they start changing everything that they're doing. Maybe they even start changing what they're picking and stuff like that because they're not beating those teams, because those teams are just straight up better. And so they get this, huge hit to their confidence and a false read on the meta because they think that they need to copy the Eastern teams and play and beat them at their own game, which they're never going to be able to do because of how much better China and Korea are than NA or even EU. And so Flyquest, I felt, was the first NA team that has come to Worlds in a very, very long time that did not just try to copy the Korean or Chinese meta, what champions they were playing or anything like that. They just played the same things that they've been playing that they thought were really, really good, that they knew the Korean and Chinese teams weren't used to playing against in solo queue or in competitive. And they pulled out these champions, and I really think that they had a unique read on the meta that was actually quite good. And one of the reasons for that is because if you look at their games, even their games versus some of the, not so good teams, like they went down 2-8 versus PSG Talent, huge goal deficit. And they came back and won that game because of their amazing team comps, the scaling comps, the unique champion picks, and finding champions that are really good that actually just aren't being played by most competitive teams. And it was those things that were carrying them through those games, even versus some of those weaker, considered to be weaker opponents. And obviously they took HLE which was the number one seed from Korea. They took them to 3 games in a best of 3. And if you look at game 1 of that series, they were actually very close to coming back in that game. I'm really surprised because some people even mentioned that, they only took one game off of HLE, but it was a fluke. But actually they ignored the fact that their first game against HLE was actually really close. And had they not made some of these very basic early game mistakes, or thrown at the end of the game, they probably had a very good chance to win that game. This is another thing that I think confuses people, because in that game, they were behind for most of the game. But they were coming back and they had won 2 or 3 team fights in a row. And while the other team had a small gold lead, their comp had outscaled the other comp. Again, it's because we're looking at the way that the game works, not just looking at, numbers and results and things like that. Sometimes a team can have a small gold lead and actually be losing because their comp is outscaled because the other champions are better at that point in the game. And so, you can't, while gold is a great metric to go off of, well, results, even over a long number of time or games, can be great at trying to tell who's good and who's bad. It isn't everything, and you need to objectively look at the game. The reason why I bring this up is because I don't actually have any issue with the vast majority of people who play the game and are just observing casually, like not knowing that, because I don't expect people to know that. The reason why I bring it up is it actually bothers me how much this mentality of not being able to analyze the actual gameplay penetrates even into the highest levels of the LCS, and I'm sure in other regions as well. Unfortunately, a lot of times there are certain players or teams that are completely overlooked and underrated, and it seems like a lot of people who don't understand the game, who are making these MVP decisions, or could be even in some cases, unfortunately, the truth is even some roster decisions for these teams are being made by people who can't objectively analyze the gameplay and simply look at the results of players in the past. And we probably have to go into a whole lot of detail in terms of actually looking at the games, in terms of looking at some other stats and stuff like that could help back some of these claims up. But my personal opinion, I'll just throw out a couple of hot takes that are interesting here that relate to this, is there's a player, right, Contracts, Juan Garcia, who I worked with when he was an amateur. And I was his analyst an analyst for Zenith Esports, which was like a really small amateur team. And it was one of the first amateur teams that he was playing with. I think he really just played with like a tournament with us, and then he was offered a good contract from an amateur team that was paying. So when I watched Contracts play, I could tell that he was like a standout player, that he was above the rest of the players that he was playing with on his team and above the rest of the players that he was playing against at that amateur level. And that's the type of thing that you want to see, because if you have play like that just completely stands out, you're probably going to be elevated to the next level. So what happened with Contract's career after that is a testament, I think, to everything that's wrong with the NALCS and the organizations and investors that run it. And what happened is he went to Cloud9 for his LCS debut and his rookie season in 2017. And they went to Worlds. They qualified for Worlds. I forget what seed they were, but they were probably pretty high, or either way, they made it out of groups, 2 quarterfinals, and they took Team WE from China to 5 games in a best of 5. And that was his rookie season. They were also very close, of course, because anytime you take a team to 5 games in a best of 5, there are always going to be decisions or mistakes that in hindsight, you even knew better, that you just make some mistakes sometimes. Nobody's perfect. No team is perfect. And so, that team could think about, one game or one moment from a game that costs them. And the whole series goes differently. So Cloud9 was very, very close to reaching semifinals that year in 2017. NA has only reached semifinals. Cloud9 actually did manage to reach semifinals a different year. I don't remember exactly all the details, but they reached semifinals because they were playing versus Dark Passage in the quarterfinals, the year that a wildcard team from the CIS or Russia or the Commonwealth of Independent States, that Dark Passage team had made it out of groups, and Cloud9 matched against them in quarterfinals. So the only time NA ever made it to quarterfinals, to semifinals, was at that because of that instance, because of a really lucky draw. Maybe, I forget now, in season 1 or season 2 if TSM was in semifinals versus Asubu, or whether they were in quarterfinals, or how that even worked. Or maybe, season 1, maybe there was an NA team, but really season 1 and season 2 were before a lot of major regions that we consider to be the best of the game now, like Korea and China, before they really were set up as a region. So, so anyways, I think that when you look at this situation with Contrax's career, the situation was that he went to Cloud9. They had an amazing international performance. And I know we just talked about how it's not about the results, it's about, how the player plays. But I guess I would say then that because we don't have time to look at every single game he played his rookie season, or to go through all of these Worlds games from years and years and years, what I'll say is that he was playing well, right? And his team, other members of the team, were playing well. And it might be surprising, why did Contrax not end up re-signing with Cloud9? And the reason is that when they went to negotiate contracts, he wanted a higher contract, a higher payout, a higher salary, because he was now one of the top performing junglers in NA and had amazing results with this team. And so he held out, waiting for a better offer. Usually, in sports or in league or anything where you have these player contracts, when you come in as a rookie, you have a very short contract, usually, like one split or 1 year. And you're not getting paid a ton. But if you become really good, you're going to want to renegotiate your contract and get paid, because now all the teams know that you are a really top tier player, and now they're not able to get away with only paying you this small amount of money like they were when you were a rookie. Now they have to fight over you. Whereas if you were a rookie, you might be happy to take a low salary just to be able to go and play for a good team like Cloud9. Once you know that you're a star and you could go to another team and make a decent amount of money, you're not necessarily going to want to continue on that contract. You're going to want to renegotiate. So they tried to renegotiate, and unfortunately, because he held out, I don't know if he held out too long or exactly what happened, or if the way that the agents usually do this negotiation on your behalf. So I don't know if his agent really screwed up. But regardless, what ended up happening next was they found Blabber, who was another really good up and coming jungler, and Contrax was sidelined and wasn't able to find another really good team, especially because many of the other best teams had probably already formed their rosters by then, or he wasn't finding the lucrative offers elsewhere that he thought he was. And so rather than being able to stay on Cloud9, part of the difficulty with these contract negotiations is all of a sudden, if you hold out and you don't find a great opportunity elsewhere and your team doesn't cave, you can just get stuck in a really bad spot where it's like, where do you go? And so Contrax ended up going to, I don't want to get this wrong, but I think he went to like Golden Guardians, or he was definitely on Golden Guardians at one point. Regardless, he went to a relatively bottom tier LCS team that was considered very, very bad. And unfortunately, it really cost years on his career, because he spent, I think, a year or 2 years or something, maybe more, floating around these bottom tier LCS teams, despite being the same amazing jungler that he had always been, that he was that first year on Cloud9, and the amazing jungler that I remember watching play in Academy and in the amateur scene. And he went from, he was the same player and the same amazing caliber of player, and yet because he had had this contract negotiation go this way, there just weren't, any spots available to him on top teams. And once he spent a year playing for a bottom tier team and them not looking too good, it made him look bad. And when teams only look at the results that that player is having and say, well, that guy can't be that good because he's on a team that's finishing, 8th or 9th or something like that. Or that guy doesn't look very good because his whole team is uncoordinated. And so his stats aren't as good because he's losing most of the time because most of his team is just worse than most of the other players in the LCS. It's not really fair to judge a player, and it's not even really relevant if you want to build a good team, especially for a good amount of money, like build a good team for the right price. It's not relevant to just look at stats or to just look at like a player's results on their whole team. You have to actually be able to analyze every decision that this player is making in game. Are they making good decisions? Are they playing the game well? And are the people on some of these top tier teams making good decisions and playing the game well? And while Blabber probably certainly had some amazing moments, and maybe his stats were really good, I don't really know very specifically. All I know about Blabber is that he continuously underperformed internationally, including multiple crab incidents. And I know that that's a meme, and it's obviously just a very negative, memorable moment that stands out. But the reality, I think, is that, in my opinion at least, Contracts objectively plays the game better than Blabber. And I still believe that that's true today. The other thing is, I think Contracts is willing to play a wider variety of champions than you usually see Blabber playing. And this isn't to specifically pick on Blabber or to hype up Contracts. Obviously, I'm biased. But the point is that this is just one example out of many of, unfortunately, we're robbed of seeing the best teams and the best talent, because at the highest level, it's competitive, but it's not as efficient as you think that it is. I think everyone likes to think that sports and esports are a complete meritocracy and that only the best players get onto teams, and that the people who are playing in the LCS, the 50 people who are playing in LCS, are absolutely the 50 best players in the region. And it's not true, right? It's not true. It has never been true. There is nepotism involved in the LCS. There's nepotism involved in sports. We see that, in multiple situations. It's a lot about who you know. Networking is extremely important, right? Who is getting tryouts? There are players that are super high up on the ranked ladder who are not getting tryouts, right? That's just the reality. And there are other players who are very well connected who don't take the game that seriously anymore. Maybe stream and play a little bit of solo queue, but not that much. They're up there, but they're not like, the top of the leaderboard. And these people could get onto a team without even having to try out. And so the reality of the situation is that we're not seeing NA's best and NA's brightest in our LCS teams. And especially because of the import situation, like I've ranted about many times before. There's some videos you can watch of me talking about this in more depth. But when the Oceanic League collapsed, all of the Oceanic players were given residency in NA, even though they're kind of imported players. So one of the reasons why you see people like Fudge and like FBI and some other players playing in the LCS even though they're oceanic players, is purely because of the fact that they don't count as imports, because you wouldn't waste an import slot on an oceanic player. But because they count as resident players and they're considered to be better than NA resident players, those players are able to compete on NA teams. This is despite the fact that, although actually the Oceanic League came back, and then now they're combined with the PCS, that Southeast Asian League has combined Oceania with it. But regardless, these are players that actually their league came back and then their league merged with another league. There's not really a reason why they need to be playing in NA. And so that's Oceanic players. You also have many Korean players, obviously, who are allowed to be imported into NA because they've lived in NA long enough that they have residency. And so those players don't even count as impact or imports anymore, like Impact and many other players. And we've gone through this before, but there's so I don't want to get too in depth into it, but there's a whole Leaguepedia page that you can look at of who is grandfathered in to count as a NA resident. And I think there's something like 50 or 60 players who count as residents in NA who are from Korea and Oceania and China and, and EU. And I think the most any other region has is maybe 5, 6, 7 players. I think maybe it's EU has 2 or 3 Korean players that count as residents because they've been playing there for so long, plus the 5 original Gambit members, the Moscow 5 members that were grandfathered in, even though they're from the CIS when that was a thing, when that was created. So we have a lot of imports playing. So 40 to 50% of our league is filled with players who aren't from NA, because we've grandfathered in many Korean players, Chinese players, EU players, Oceanic players. Many of these people are still playing. Those people who are grandfathered in don't even count as an import slot, and then each team is allowed to have 2 imports. So you have many teams that have 2 or 3 players who aren't from the United States, Canada, NA. I guess Mexico's in there, but I don't think we've had many Mexican players in the LCS before. Anyways, the point is that we're working with imported players. They're like half the spots in our league. Because of that, the actual NA players who would be playing in those spots for decades, by the way, for over a decade now, never got to play, never got the experience, because that rule exists that allows there to be 2 imports per team plus 50 or 60 players who are grandfathered in. Now, of course, many of them thankfully don't play anymore, or have retired, or have moved on from NA to another region, but it's just a ridiculous system if what your whole goal is to limit international competition to 2 events per year. We're lucky that we're getting a third mini event, international event next year. And it's supposed to test which region is better than what region. And you're supposed to see all this domestic play, and then you see all this international play. When our league is half international, and we're not allowing our players to develop because half of the spots in our league aren't really going to be available to NA players. And a lot of people's argument against that is, well, they should be better than the Korean players that are coming in. But that's just not realistic. As we've talked about before, when you have 4 times as many people playing on the server, your top 50 players from Korea are going to be a lot better than the top 50 players from NA. And so the reality is that the people who end up playing in the NALCS are, maybe the 12th best Korean top laner or something like that comes over to NA because he's not good enough to have a good career in Korea. And how is an NA top laner supposed to compete with that? And why should they have to compete with that when they're supposed to compete with that when they go to Worlds or at MSI internationally at these international events? Domestic leagues are supposed to be for domestic play. And now, of course, we're losing an extra 2 teams So that's going to be even more roster spots that can't be filled. We don't even have 50 players anyways, right? That's when we had 10 teams, 5 players per team. Obviously, we're down to 8 teams now, and we'll be down to 6 teams next year. We're also losing a world spot to Brazil, which is also done, again, not for competitive reasons, but for viewership reasons. Does NA deserve to lose a world spot? Maybe. NA is definitely not as good as it used to be, especially when it comes to the third team. Now, it's a very complicated, nuanced situation, right? Because our third team was definitely worse than we've ever seen an NA third team be before. But our first team was probably better than we've ever seen an NA first team be in a very long time, and better than the EU first seed. So did NA deserve to lose a world spot? I don't know, maybe. But the question is who should we have lost the world spot to? And it probably should have been to the PCS, to PSG Talent, teams like that. Obviously, Taiwan had always been a very strong region before it used to be a major region when Flash Wolves AHQ were there. That was a major region that was afforded 2 or 3 world spots every year for a stretch of time. So I don't know why we would give the world spot to Brazil instead of the PCS, except for the fact that Brazil is a very, very rapidly growing region, and so it's all about viewership. It's not that Brazil deserves a world spot over the PCS. It's that Brazil has a good new viewership base, and so they're just giving that viewership base a permanent world spot, which I think is a bit ridiculous. But again, it's that at the upper echelons of League of Legends, it's not as much of a meritocracy as you think that it is. A lot of team owners, a lot of investors, a lot of even like general managers and stuff like that do not know how to evaluate players objectively, like the way that they're playing the game objectively. They look at stats, they look at results, they look at the performance of the whole team that person was on, and they have a hard time picking out the person's individual contribution to it and whether that player is really good or not. And so if a player gets stuck on a really bottom tier team, they're going to look really bad and they will have a hard time finding success in the LCS. Going back to contracts for a second, the only reason why he was in a good position again is because somehow, out of nowhere, even though NRG was not supposed to be that good of a team, again, bouncing around on these bottom tier teams, NRG actually managed to prove by having multiple players, including him, play well enough that they actually won LCS, that it kind of showed to those orgs again who had slept on a player like Contracts that, okay, this guy is actually really good again. I forgot how good he was. Maybe he should go to another team. But then, of course, now he's in, I don't really know what the situation is with him right now, but he's in a precarious situation because NRG is one of the 2 teams that's being like exiting the league. And so he'll have to find another team if he can. Hopefully he can, now that his draft stock or whatever you want to call it has risen a little bit because of the performance that NRG had previously. But I mean, we'll see about that. And NRG did not qualify for Worlds this year, although it was close. So, really tough situation there. So I just have to say that when half of the league is imported players, native players aren't getting the experience that they should be getting. Teams and owners and managers can't objectively analyze the gameplay of players. And so sometimes people who are terrible are getting spots and getting invited to tryouts. People who are great aren't ever getting invited to tryouts. It's about who you know sometimes to make it onto a roster rather than how good you are as a player. That's just facts. Even players have a lot of input, especially because there's some of the few people who understand how certain other players are contributing to their team. And so in a lot of cases, teams are sometimes leaving it up to players to try to figure out, who they want to play with and who they don't want to play with in the future, which can sometimes be decided based on the team objectively understanding who's actually performing well and who's not, but sometimes can just end up being a cliquey mess where people advocate for their friends and don't advocate for people that, maybe actually try hard and grind the game all day, but aren't like going out and doing stuff with them. The whole thing's just ridiculous. So to get back to Flyquest and my thoughts on this series, because obviously I rambled on and lost track, but I guess I would say that Flyquest performed how I thought that they would. They showed that they are capable of being a championship team, but I'm really disappointed, like I said I thought I would be in the video, with the way that they played, because I knew that they had the potential to win Worlds this year, and they just weren't quite good enough at some very, very small things. There were a lot of little mistakes, especially in game 2, in the early game, that cost them in the same way that we went over in that video. And I think in game 5, they really got thrown off their game, because it sounded like, and I heard an interview, I forget who it was, but somebody on Flyquest was saying, it sounds like they kind of forgot about Smolder in the draft. And when Smolder got drafted and they realized that they were actually getting outscaled in the draft, it really threw with their, messed with their game, because usually Flyquest was drafting these outscaling comps, but in that game they were actually getting outscaled. And so all of a sudden they were in this doomed draft situation in game 5, where they had to fight a lot early and try to get really far ahead early, and otherwise they were going to lose to Smolder. And they couldn't find any openings because Gen.G is such a good Korean team. And so for that one game, game 5, because of forgetting about Smolder in the draft and that sort of, and I'm sure some other things, and not, they were kind of forced to play for one game, do the classic NA thing of coming into Worlds and trying to beat Korea at their own game. They had to try to win early game versus just too good of a Korean team, and they couldn't do it. But I think that there was definitely opportunity for them to win that series. And so when you keep in mind that Flyquest had a, very close 3-game best of 3 versus HLE, Korea's number 1 seed, that they could have won, and they had a very close 5-game best of 5 series against Gen.G, who's probably the better team out of HLE. Gen.G and HLE have traded series back and forth. But it looks like Gen.G is the stronger team right now. So if they were able to potentially, if they had just been a little bit better and made a little bit fewer early game mistakes in these games like we talked about, they would have been able to beat the Korean number 1 seed and the Korean number 2 seed, which means I truly believe that they were fundamentally capable of winning Worlds, but they were just this much short of actually doing that and accomplishing that and playing well enough to do that. So the whole thing's pretty sad. I'm still pretty, depressed about the whole thing. Obviously, I had my take, and in some ways, I wanted my take to be borne out to be correct, but I think that them doing well would have also shown that I knew what was going on. But more importantly, I wanted them to win, and so it's sad and disappointing to see that they lost. I do think that they are making esports more fun. I think that League is always more fun when teams are creative with the way that they play. I think that NA teams, when they show up to international events, need to stop trying to beat the Koreans at their own game, the Chinese at their own game. And I think that, like I talked about before, it's so sad that we haven't seen NA teams go to Worlds and try to innovate. Because in my mind, when I think of some of the best moments at Worlds where teams overperformed expectations, like you think of teams like Dark Passage. So remember, we talked about Dark Passage from the CIS, made it out of groups as a wildcard team. What did they do? They were playing Brand and Anivia and Poppy when teams were not playing these champions. And they were using like Poppy Anivia as a combo where they could like Anivia wall and Poppy slam people with E into the Anivia wall. They were doing creative things, and it was like Brand support, Lecrypt playing Brand support. So obviously they came in with the expectation that they're not going to beat these other teams playing their own, or playing those teams the way that those teams want them to be playing them, or by playing the meta. They're only going to beat those teams by playing their own game and their own meta. When Gigabyte Marines first came onto the scene internationally and was doing really well with Levi, a lot of the reason was because they were having a lot of success on Nocturne, which was a champion that not a lot of other teams were playing, not used to playing against it, and they executed on it, right? It gave them a clear, simple game plan where Levi would farm really heavily for level 6 and surprise the enemy team with how fast he was getting it without really showing them, like showing on the map and showing what level he was, so they'd have no idea what time he was going to get it. And they'd all in off of it every time, and that was one of the reasons why Gigabyte Marines was having so much success initially at MSIs and things like that versus TSM. Obviously, Levi was just a really amazing jungler in general, but I think that there's a pattern historically of teams that have low expectations or maybe aren't that good overperforming when they play their own style, when they don't try to change all of the champions that they've been practicing and all of the team comps that they've been practicing throughout the year, and instead go into Worlds just playing what they know how to play. And I think that sometimes people get caught up in, well, because the Korean teams and the Chinese teams are the best in the world, that means that they're the best at everything. And that's not true. The Korean teams and the Chinese teams are very good mechanically. They are very good at early and late game and mid game macro decisions. And I know that sounds like a lot because, well, that's kind of like the whole game, right? It's like macro and micro. They're pretty good. But actually, there's more to the game than that, right? There's itemization and coming up with interesting or creative or more efficient builds. And there are a lot of mistakes that pro players make with itemization still that they're working on. You see, well, I mean, we don't have to get into specific itemization. I'll actually talk about that in a different video. But anyway, so there's itemization mistakes, there's draft mistakes, there's bad reads on the meta. There's especially a lack of innovation when it comes to champion picks out of Korea. You can even see this in solo queue. Like, go to op.gg and look at the pick rate of the champions in different roles, and you'll see like 30%, 20%, and like the top 5 champions will be like 90% of the pick rate in that role. So when you're playing Korean solo queue, you're probably only going to play against the same 5 supports, the same 5 AD carries that region believes is meta over and over and over again. Well, what happens when a Western team realizes that, hey, Ivern jungle is actually really good, and they're just not playing that at all in Korean solo queue because they don't realize it's good, and Korean players never get any practice against playing against it, not nearly as much as Western players do, and all of a sudden they're playing against this champion. You're putting a region who's used to playing the same champions over and over and over again into a weird situation where, like, how do I play competitively versus this champion I've maybe only played versus once in my career, or like, and it was years ago, or like maybe I've never played against it at all, or maybe in solo queue, Bwipo has played Urgot or whatever hundreds of times, and this Korean guy who he's going up against has played against Urgot in solo queue like 5 times in the past year or something. You can create huge advantages through things like better itemization, better draft, because I truly believe that the thing that NA has that is better than China or Korea is innovation and creativity. Same goes for you. So you have to win through innovation and creativity. And the way that you express that in League is through builds, itemization, it's through draft, it's through the meta, it's through champion picks, because you find a strategy that they're not used to playing against, that you can practice a lot and execute on well, that maybe gives you something like, for example, we recognize that scaling is really OP, because when you're playing against a team that's going to beat you early anyways, like, picking early game champions that have to get ahead early is not going to go well for you if you're always losing early, because the players are just better and you're not able to make all of the right decisions. So when you play a scaling team comp and you really commit to that, all of a sudden, as long as you don't fall too far behind versus a Korean team that's executing really well on their laning, now you can just outscale them and have a chance to win. The problem that I have, and one of the things that makes me so disappointed in this, and I said this in the previous one, is that unfortunately the window in which the innovator has an edge is very short, because teams see what you're doing, and I guarantee you that in the start of the next year, barring any massive changes that completely change those the viability of those champion picks, if Flyquest displays that a champion like Ivern is actually very good and very underrated, given time to actually go and practice that, Korean and Chinese teams will just go practice that and then come back next year and execute the same thing better than you. And so unless Riot really shakes things up, or you can somehow find something that's better than that and continue to be ahead of them creatively, you lose your edge, and then your opportunity goes away. So I think the problem moving forward into the future is that any edge that Flyquest had is going to be less next year. And so this was really their shot, and that's what I was trying to get across in that last video, is that Flyquest had the potential to win Worlds, but they needed to do it now, and they didn't seem like they were in good enough form early game in order to be able to do that because of the poor decisions that they were making, and just some of the careless deaths that they were having in the early game. And unfortunately, for one, I don't think that it'll be easy to stay ahead in terms of having a creative edge year after year after year. I think that's really hard. And number two, league teams and rosters change very rapidly, almost every split. And so I don't know what's going on behind the scenes, but I imagine it will be hard for Flyquest to stay together. We already see from, the community and stuff like that, a lot of people were saying that Bwipo should be replaced because he was making a lot of those mistakes. Other people are saying that obviously like Flyquest bot lane, like maybe Busio is not, I even said that like it doesn't seem like maybe Busio has such a wide champion pool, and he's obviously like a rookie, and I think he played decently well, but I don't know for an innovative team like that, someone who's really only committed to playing tank engaged supports and seems a bit lost when he's not on those champions. I don't know that, he necessarily fits in well with the team. But because there's all of the, all of these calls, I would say this. I think Flyquest should stick together and not kick anyone off the roster. That's my opinion. Now, obviously, their roster will probably change regardless of what I think, of course. But teams in League have way too much of a tendency to just scapegoat somebody on the team who they felt like didn't play super well. And they're willing to throw away a year of practicing together and of having synergy together as a team to potentially slightly upgrade one player in one position or two players in two different positions. And I think that it's a ridiculous concept. I think that league teams change rosters way, way, way too much. Part of it is because players, feel like they have very short careers and they'd be wasting their time if they don't search for other opportunities to play with different players. But to be honest, if you ask me, what is the best chance for NA to win Worlds next year, or to do well at Worlds next year, like they did this year, or at least the number one seed did, it would be for Flyquest to stay together. Because as I pointed out in the last video, while they were faltering, they were the best Western team that we've seen in a very long time. And these early game mistakes that they were making are actually relatively simple and straightforward. And if they had some good in-game coaching, then they would be golden. It may be difficult to maintain their draft edge, but if they maintain the same coaches and stuff like that, I don't see why they can't potentially do the same thing next year. So I think Flyquest should actually stay together. I think that any team that is doing pretty well, even if they end up losing, should probably stay together. But that's probably not going to happen because that's not really how League works. So this is another issue, I think, with League teams, is that they change their rosters too much, too often. think that's about it. It was a good run. It's a little bit disappointing because I really do think that they were really close to having a shot at winning Worlds, and they just weren't quite good enough, and that always feels so much worse than if you're just terrible. But there's a lot more to be proud of there than if you're just straight up terrible. I mean, obviously, it's a lot better to be close to winning than to be terrible. So it is what it is. Maybe next year. With that being said, good luck in solo queue and have a wonderful day.